I'm thrilled to be here with everyone today. I'm Catherine Reynolds Lewis, the founder of the Institute for Independent Journalists, whose mission is the financial and emotional sustainability of freelancers of color. And as someone who started in business journalism and still writes about personal finance and business, I am really excited for this session on those topics. And we have an amazing moderator with us today to guide us through this conversation. Shernay Williams is an independent video journalist and entrepreneur who's run a content firm, served as an entrepreneurship consultant, and launched a national business directory for Black mom-owned businesses in the US. In 2023, she became host and lead producer of the Griot's series, A Taste of Chocolate. Her digital media brand, The Black Mompreneur, features independently produced video reports. A Baltimore native just up the street from me, Shernay moderates virtual panel discussions and produces video content for Comcast's National Public Affairs Program and other organizations such as the IIJ. Her journalism career started at the Afro newspaper in Baltimore, and since then she has done it all, served as an anchor reporter for local TV news stations in the South and Northeast, and her freelance work has appeared in MarketWatch, Barron's, Fast Company, and many more. So I'm going to turn it over to Shernay. Thank you so much for guiding us through this conversation, and thank you again to our speakers.
Yes, thank you, Catherine, for inviting me to moderate. I'm really excited. We have some great panelists, and so I'll jump right into the introductions for them. So we'll start with Manseen Logan. She's a freelance editor at Insider, and her focus is business. Before joining Insider, she was an editor at Complex Media, where she edited the Life section and created political articles for the Webby-nominated Pull Up and Vote campaign. Manseen received her MFA in writing from Savannah College of Art and Design, and she currently resides in New Jersey, where she spends her free time managing Liberian projects and athlete profiles. Hello, Manseen. Then we have Mike Dang. He's an editor at the New York Times on the business desk. He was previously a senior editor at The Counter, where he helped develop a podcast investigating the National School Lunch Program and was the longtime editor-in-chief of Long Reads, which was nominated for 4 National Magazine Awards. In 2012, he co-founded The Billfold, a personal finance site for young people. Hello there, Mike. And rounding out our panel, we have Reyhan Harmanci, who is a senior editor at Businessweek. Previously, she worked at Gimlet as the head of society and culture programming, Topic Magazine, Fast Company, and BuzzFeed. Hello there, Reyhan. All right, so thank you all for being here. Let's jump into the questions because we have a lot of them. We want to start with what types of stories that you all accept from independent journalists and how much freelance work you take relative to in-house pieces. So Manseen, let's start with you.
Okay, yeah, sure thing. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation to be on this panel. So for me, 100% of the stories I take are freelance and contributor stories. So just to clarify, like I'm a staff editor, but I edit freelance and contributors at Business Insider. And that is 100% of the stories I take in.
Got it. Mike?
Yeah, so I oversee personal finance here at the New York Times, but really any sort of story that relates to money at all you don't need to think about like personal finance as it is traditionally. And I work with staff reporters here, but I am open to working with freelancers all the time. There isn't a limit. Just email me, and if the story works for us, it works for us, and I'll let you know if one of our staff reporters is already working on it. But yeah, I love working with freelancers. So yeah.
We love to hear it. Reyhan, what about you?
So happy to be here. It's interesting. Businessweek is a weekly magazine, and we do work quite a bit with freelancers. Although, to be candid, I think that has changed over time in a way where we draw more from the newsroom than in previous incarnations. So I'm always happy to entertain pitches and, see what we can make work on the web or in the magazine. But there is a kind of higher threshold for pitches to be published, in that like it has to be something that like you could make the case that like Bloomberg as a whole wouldn't already have done or wouldn't already have a reporter on. I think there's some sensitivity around kind of like stepping on different kind of desk toes. So I think that's just something to think about if when you're pitching Bloomberg Businessweek, is this something that you have seen already published at Bloomberg?
We appreciate that transparency. And so what about, how can we, like you were saying, the preference will probably be the in-house reporters. And so what can we bring to the table that could be different? How can we display that in a pitch?
I mean, I think that, there's always a sense of like, is this a story that only the person who's pitching can tell, or does the person pitching offer a unique perspective? Something that goes beyond kind of like commodity news and Businessweek also tends to take the freelancing we tend to publish is long form features. So that's where like a unique perspective or some kind of immersion in a subject could help us make the case that this is like not for the newsroom. That being said, there's a few other places in the Businessweek universe where we take freelance. One of them is a shorter weekly feature called Remarks that is more news analysis than anything else. It's not an op-ed, and very much Businessweek is not like the first person, but it is also a place where someone's unique perspective or vantage point can be leveraged, I think.
Got it. And opening it back up to everyone, I'm a video journalist, so I have to ask, right, do you accept video or audio pieces as well? And what does that process look like? We can start with Mike this time.
I mean, I'm open to it. The thing about the New York Times is there are very large video teams and obviously a very large audio team here already. So if that were to happen, it wouldn't be something that I would be overseeing. But I will say, with the new audio app that the Times has launched recently, it's sort of like almost like a radio station. Something that's been happening a lot is a freelancer will work on a story with me, and then the audio team will be like, "This sounds like a great story. I would love for the reporter to come on, who worked on this story, to talk about like how they developed that story, and then read the story, and then it goes into the audio app, right?" So like that is one example of how a story that initially is maybe just for our print or website ends up on audio. I haven't had anything become a video piece, but I don't think that that would never happen. Especially now that the Times, it takes them a while to get to things. Like they have a TikTok account. I've never seen it. They are very particular about like how they do that type of video content. They don't really do reels, I don't think, but they are starting to do those type of things. Because obviously that's where a lot of audiences are now. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of time for them to figure out how they can do it, and they have very high standards. So, I wish I could just like, be like, yes, let's just make a video, put it up. No. There's like really big layers that you have to go through to get anything like that done. So.
Yes, makes sense. Appreciate that. And so the best bet is to pitch a written piece, and then possibly it could, yeah. Okay, Manseen.
Yeah, so personally, I'm on the editorial side, so I'm always accepting business stories that humanize the business world, first-person essays, as told to stories, job diaries. But I did ask about this, and we do have a video team that's constantly accepting pitches. They said that they get most of their video content pitches from Glimmer, which was formerly called Story Hunter. So if you're not on Glimmer, get on that, because that's where they are seeking pitches. And then I was also given a document, because depending on the package that video creators are pitching, you have to approach it a different way and to a different producer. So I'm just going to drop that in the chat right now. But that,
Thank you.
you're welcome. That's for all the video folks.
Okay, great. And Reyhan, what about you?
Oh my goodness. Sort of echoing Mike, I can't even imagine what it would take to scale video and audio at Bloomberg. But we have a television mechanism and a radio. So I think that it's like, I don't think at this moment there's any capability of accepting freelance.
Got it. Again, appreciate the transparency. And I know that you mentioned that you're looking for long form. What about the rest of you? What length are we looking at for the types of stories that you want to accept? Whoever would like to go first.
Okay, I could jump in. Me specifically, I like the shorter form stories. If you could tell a good story in 500 to 800 words, I'm all on that because I'm constantly addressing freelancers and working on different drafts, but also there's opportunities for longer essays that might go up to maybe 1,300 words where you're really sharing something that's maybe not as known. And so we have to give a little bit of a deeper back dive. So yeah, it really ranges, but I usually edit stories on the shorter end and probably up to 1,300 words.
Yeah, it ranges for me too. For shorter stories, around 800 words. Most of the pitches I get typically around 1,500 words. If it gets beyond 2,000 words, we can talk about it. We need to have a case for why stories are for more than 2,000 words, and that's just not just me, but like in the newsroom in general for all of our reporters here too. If you are working on a story more than 2,000 words, you have to make a case for it. And then it's this whole thing where like you have to get approved by all these other people. They're asking like, why are we putting so much time and resources into this story? So you really have to make a case for it. But for 1,500 words, that's fairly typical for me, and that's the majority of the pitches I get.
Okay. And just a reminder that if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. We're going to leave time at the end to answer any of your questions. And so now let's talk about how to structure these pitches. I know email is probably best. I'm sure we can all agree to that one, but can you get into some details about how we should structure the pitch, the length? Should we just have an idea, or should we have a completely fleshed out and have done pre-interviews and things like that? Reyhan, let's start with you.
So interesting, because I think that like different editors tend to like different things. But I mean, at Businessweek, so every Thursday we have a features meeting, and that's where all the editors collect their pitches that have been that they think are in good enough shape for discussion. So like when you're pitching a feature, like imagine it's going to a room of people to read it for the first time. And so I think they have to be pretty baked if you're going to be pitching like a 3,000 to 6,000 word feature story. Because if there are questions in the room, even if Businessweek is interested, I will just bounce them right back to you, and then the process kind of can take a really long time. I think for other stories where it's like a remarks, which is really kind of like an idea that's like 1,500 words max, like, I think that the strength of the idea will carry it. I think you probably just need like a paragraph sort of, and that's a space that's designed to be newsier than like the feature well. And then of course, I think that when people are pitching, this is just like the perennial advice, but it's like, read the publication you're pitching to. That's the best way you're going to find out what is going to work. Like, would this feel at home with the other things you're seeing there?
Excellent advice. Manseen?
Yes, so since I'm looking at 100% pitches all through the day, it's very easy for pitches to get buried between all the other emails. So I like to have pitch in the subject line. I advise writers, for me personally, do not send me a draft, because if it's already written, I'm not going to read it. Just for my own preference, because I get a lot of pitches with similar ideas, and I don't want anyone thinking that, we're taking ideas and giving to other writers. So it's not necessary to send a full draft, but just to send a very strong paragraph with the subject, talking about the topic. And if it grabs my eye and my attention, I will definitely try to respond. If I don't respond immediately and it's a good pitch, it might not be a good timing, but I try to go back to pitches that maybe just the wrong time, right idea. And also I will say that oftentimes, because we know what our readers like to read at Business Insider, when we have worked with strong writers, we will sometimes send them topics that we are chasing if they're on our pitch list. And then it's all about getting like a very fascinating source to follow through with that topic.
Mike?
Yeah, it really depends, because with personal finance, obviously some stories are very personal, so you don't have to do a lot of career reporting. It's mostly like, this is something that I've been experiencing. I want to write about, how I've kind of dealt with it. And, for that kind of pitch, you don't really need to do much except share your story and why it's compelling. For some other stories that do require reporting, for example, if you saw a report about, all employees at a company who are getting into debt for whatever different reasons, and you've shown that you are able to get access to some of these people that you can talk to, that would be great, beyond just like, because I get a lot of pitches sometimes where it's like, I want to look into something, but you should have already looked into it before you got in, before you sent me that pitch, because a lot of people look into it and then they find out no one wants to talk to them, or, the story isn't going to work out. So you should have a sense that you can put the story together, because you have reporting resources, experts that, you have, that will be willing to talk to you a lot of different things. Like, obviously I'm not asking you to like do all the reporting, but at least some initial part of that to demonstrate to me that you are able to do the story.
And I'm sure this will vary, but how quickly do you typically respond to pitches? A good one, a good pitch.
I mean, I feel like coming out of this, I might get a lot of pitches at once, because that kind of happens. Like, I'll do a call for pitches and then I'll get 100, and that will take some time. But when I'm not doing these type of events or doing a call for pitches, they kind of trickle in, and I'm much faster. And the way that I try to get back to everyone, just because I know it sucks when nobody gets back to you. But so oftentimes I'll just be like one sentence, like, this story is not going to work for me because a reporter is working on it, or because we've done it already. And it will be really short, but I'm not trying to be cold or anything like that. It's just like, there's just so much to get through. So,
well, it's a miracle that you even respond to everyone. So I don't think everybody can say that. All right, Manseen?
Yes, that's really dope, Mike, because responding to everyone, that seems like an impossible task sometimes. So I tip my hat to you. I try to respond if it's a good pitch that's perfectly timed, that's right on brand, and everything is just locked in. I will probably respond within 24 hours. If I don't respond within 24 or 48 hours, then it's probably not the right timing, in which case I could come back and respond 3 months, 6 months later. If I remember, oh, I saw something like this in my inbox, I might have started, I'll come back to it. But typically that is the case. And then there are instances where I know it's not gonna work. And if somebody continues to pitch that idea, maybe after the third time, I might come back and just quickly say, sorry, I'll have to pass on this. But if it's a solid pitch, I would say within 48 hours, that's usually my goal.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm working. This is, like, this year, I think I got a lot better at responding within a week. That was my goal, of clearing out my inbox every week. Doesn't always happen. But generally I try to respond within a week, one way or the other. Are we gonna, and usually the response, if we're gonna move forward, is like to have a phone call or a conversation, especially if it's a feature story, to kind of like understand exactly, you know, what's going on and what the timing considerations are, and what the access would be. I can be much faster with no's. But yeah, but I also, you know, after a week, I think it's totally fair game for a nudge from a writer, you know, and for them to put sort of like, you know, like, hey, if I don't hear from you, I'm going to pitch it elsewhere, or whatever. Like, I think, you know, I think that it seems a little bit gendered to me. I feel like men typically have no problem nudging after like 5 minutes, you know, and then like I feel like a lot of other people can, you know, feel like they're worried about being a bother. And I think it's like, you know, you're doing your job and I'm trying to do my job. So I appreciate the nudge.
And that's a really good note. Still got to do it. This is a business for you. If you're building your freelance business, you know, this is how you get work. So definitely shouldn't be afraid to follow up. Excellent advice. Let's get into pay rates. Yay. This can vary, of course, from publication to publication. So can you share your rates, even if it's a range, because, you know, I'm sure it varies, but can you share that range and if it's negotiable, depending on the story?
Yeah, so I make my rate public and it's fairly straightforward. It is $1 a word for anything for every writer. So we think that having that public is good because, you know, there have been times where some writers get paid more than others for, you know, for doing the same amount of work. And then, you know, it should just be straightforward. So for us, it's $1 a word. It's not really negotiable because that's what my desk told me. That's what we pay. So that's what we pay. And I will say though, if I've been working with someone for a few years, I will try to be like, we should try to get this person paid a little bit more because they've been working with us for a few years and their work is great. And so that's a whole thing, but it takes a few years to get to that point of like, you know, having a relationship with an editor. So
It's amazing that it's public, that you know, put the rate out there. That's great. Reyhan?
Yeah, I feel like that is best practices, Mike. I say we start the conversation $1 a word. And the conversation usually does not end there. And I think that, like, you know, especially for features, it's important that we compensate people for what can be months of work.
Manseen?
Yes. So with this rate, it pretty much varies depending on the relationship with the writer, how long, similar to what Mike said, how long they've been working and writing with the designated editor. For me, typically the rate starts at 300 or 350. And these are for, again, specifically quick first person essays or as told tos, which are recorded and then transcribed, telling another source's story. And again, for that specific format, which is mostly what I work with, that is the starting rate.
And contracts are imperative in a business. And so what can you share about the contracts for freelancers and what those look like as far as copyright, license terms, derivative rights, indemnification? Anything you can share?
yes, so for the Times retains the rights, but you know, if a story gets syndicated or is turned into something else, it splits all the fees 50-50. And I mean, you know, it's a case by case basis. If you're just like, I'm getting a book out of this, right? Like we will work with you. Like we have a team, a legal team that does all of that stuff and try to make it very fair. And then with indemnification, the New York Times gets sued all the time, and they will usually want to sue the Times and not you personally because they think that they can get a lot more from the institutions. So if that happens, obviously all we require is for you to work with us, provide us all your reporting notes and all those different things. But our legal team, which is very big here, will take care of all of that. So, but I don't think you'll get sued writing a personal finance, or hopefully not.
Yes, hopefully not.
I don't have a lot to share about Bloomberg's contracts. But just to say that, like, to echo Mike, like, most things are negotiable. If there's something that's very important to you that needs to be a carve out, we would work with you. And I haven't heard of a lot of turmoil about our contracts, for better or worse, and I think that can also be a situation where, if you negotiate a pay rate that feels fair, your point of view on certain parts of the contract could change, where you're like, well, like, I'm less concerned about IP because this story is going to like bring in enough income that, whatever, so I think that, like, always negotiate.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and just repeat kind of what Reyhan said. I can't share much about the contract, but I will say that whatever writer, I've never seen any issues personally, but if a writer does have any questions about it, they're definitely able to be put in touch with the legal team and they can address, any concerns they have. And I also just want to double back or rewind back to the rate very quickly, because I just want to make it clear that for the rate that I stated, that's specifically for the Business Insider desk that I'm on, but the rates do vary across Business Insider. So if you go to another desk and it's lower or higher, I just want to make sure no one's like, hey, that's not the truth. It's the truth.
Yes, thank you for that. All right. Yes, contracts are so important. Make sure you ask questions. Now, can we go into some examples of successful freelance pitches, story ideas that worked really well and why they resonated? And Manseen, also wanted to do a quick note. So you don't just take personal essays, right? You take different formats. I think someone had a question about that.
Yes, I do take different formats.
Okay. So yeah, since your mic is open, could you start with an example of a freelance pitch that went really well?
Okay, yeah. And just to kind of like follow up on the different formats, it could be a first person essay that's on a trending business topic. It could be an as told to, which means it's not your personal story, but you have a very fascinating source who falls in line with the topics, that we're currently pursuing. It could be a job diary of like a CEO who is doing big things and they're just sharing their day. So it really ranges. But a successful pitch that we recently got, I actually just published this. I cover a lot of career-focused stories, and right now on our desk, everyone's interested in what Gen Z is feeling about their careers. And we actually had an as told to of a Gen Z worker who was shocked by the 9-to-5, and she really expressed why the 9-to-5 life kind of caught her off guard, and what she would prefer, and how she feels that Gen Z could possibly usher in this new way of living, or how life should be lived. So again, it's a very personal story, still career focused, still very business. And that's a successful one. I also wanted to share specifically with, I get a lot of pitches. Well, actually, no, I'll wait for this one. I'll let everyone share their story, but that's a successful pitch example.
Okay, don't forget that nugget you want to share with us later.
I won't.
Mike?
Yeah, so Rangers, so some people have just a straight personal story where it's kind of like my estranged father, gave me $1 million when he died, and I didn't have a good relationship with him, and I spent all that money, right? And that's just like its own thing. But I really like personal stories that sort of show something that's happening wider within our culture and society. For example, I had a writer who wrote a story about how for most of her life, she thought she was just really bad at money and spending. And then she got a late diagnosis in her late 30s that she had ADHD. And once she started addressing that, suddenly a lot of her financial problems were being solved. And and apparently this is the thing, there's late diagnosis of ADHD in women. And for a lot of them, when it happens, a lot of their financial problems are solved, right? So it started out as this like personal story, but looking at this sort of larger trend and issue, and then talking to experts about what is happening. So that is a great example of maybe something personal that's sort of like a reported essay kind of thing. And then I was just like, if you're just like really good at reporting. So I had a writer who was like, I saw a report come out from the National Labor Relations Board about employees who signed contracts where if they left their job early, they would have to pay their employer $10,000, $50,000. So they were indebted to their employers. And she was like, and there are people that the NLRB mentions in the story that are willing to talk to me for the story, right? So it's kind of like I was going to work at this nail salon, and then I quit after 2 months because I didn't like working there, and now they're suing me for $5,000, right? And that became a whole thing. But she just really showed that she had the ability to read reports closely and also find sources very quickly, and really great. And that obviously not a personal story at all, but a story that does deal with money, not exactly personal finance, like in the terms of like how we save and spend, but the way that money affects people in their jobs. So that is also a really great example, but also sort of like fun things like, I try to bring more fun to the Times because the Times can be very stodgy sometimes. So like, I had a writer who pitched me like, I broke up with my boyfriend and I spent all this money, and I think this is something that people do all the time. So I'm going to talk to all these people who like what kind of crazy things they spent money on after they had a breakup, right? Just a really fun story about how we spend our money, right? Like, so that type of thing too. So it can really range.
I love that. Love that. Reyhan?
Yeah, we took a story earlier this year from a writer I've never worked with, who was pitching a piece about the indigenous art market in New Mexico, and how it's kind of like fraud is rampant, and like why like there's like the legislative answers have been really unsatisfying. And we went back and forth a bit with the pitch, but it ended up working out really well. And it ran as part of like our equality issue. And I was just kind of to Mike's point, like the pitch came in, I was sort of like, well, this is interesting, but like I need to understand the scope of the problem. Like this can't be just like a local issue. Like Businessweek requires scale a lot of times in terms of how they cover things. And she put in the work and like kind of was able to kind of like size the market of native art fraud, and had to go through a lot of documents to get there. And so I think that it's I hope it was a lot of work, but I was really happy with how it turned out.
Great examples. What does the editing process look like? From pitch to deadline to publication. What's typically the timeline, and then how many rounds of edits could we expect for our pieces on average? I'm sure it varies. Yeah, Reyhan, you can start.
Like 1 million. Businessweek is hands-on, especially when it comes to print. The process is the same for digital, but I like to actually not publish in print. I think that it's like often I feel like it's not making the story better. But you could expect to file a draft. First you get kind of top line notes, usually kind of directional or structural. At that point, there'll either be another editor involved, or it'll be a thing where I like kick it back to the writer once or twice before we have a top editor. There's a top editor who also gives notes. Then it goes back to the writer. And then it gets to a place where we're like, okay, can it go to the copy desk? It'll go to the copy desk at least twice through this process. And it's just kind of like passing back and forth. Often there'll be a third editor at least kind of like back reading before it gets put in layout. So it can be kind of a lot, but it's also like one of the best parts of the job is the care and like concern the magazine has, which often is not fun when it's happening, But later on, I feel grateful to have the structure, and then like lawyers get involved, and we just take it really seriously. But it's a lot,
Mhm. But the end product will be solid.
It has to be.
Right, it has to be. Manseen?
Yes. So this range really depends. If it is a story that was pitched with a hard deadline, it's attached to some type of moment, it's not as evergreen, then the edits come very, very quickly. Again, because we're dealing with very straightforward as told twos and first person. So the edits can probably be completed within a week, back and forth. If it takes more, if it's a hard deadline, it takes more than a week or 2 weeks, it's probably an issue. And that means that we're not really getting what we need, in which case the story could potentially be killed if it misses that deadline. If it's an evergreen story, it really depends, because the draft could come in, and if everything moves smoothly, it could be turned around again within a week or two. If there are hiccups, that's not really anyone's fault, just needs a little bit more diving or some redirection. The draft could be extended, because again, it's like a cycle, things keep moving. So once you kind of miss that moment to land an evergreen story, it goes on to the next story that, that's time frame, and your draft might get sat down for a while. Then I get the email like, hey, is this still going? And I'm like, oh yes, let me pick it up and try to figure out how to put it back in rotation. So the best thing, a clean draft can get turned around in 2 weeks. If there's more work, or if a writer might needs more time, then that's when it starts to get a little bit uncertain. It will come up, but it's just going to take some time, and we have to kind of play it by ear.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Yeah, so for me, I always have an initial phone call with the writer about their story, and then we'll talk about on that call what the editing process will be like based on what their story is. And the first thing that we will do, even before all of that, is we'll talk about what the sources might look like for the story, because part of the advanced planning for our stories is I need to let our photo editors know if we need to do a photo shoot of any of the sources in the story. And that is important for the writer to know, because you have to ask them, like, while you're reporting, are you comfortable with having your photo in the paper? If you are, let me know your information, and then the Times will send a photographer over, and the photographers, the photo editors really want all of that in advance. And if that is not an option, then I'm going to have to talk to the art department and get an illustration ready, and that also takes a lot of different time. So we will talk about that on our initial call, and then I will do, like Reyhan said, we'll have like a really quick top edit in Google Docs, and then that Google Doc will be transferred into the New York Times system, which is called Scoop. Unfortunately, our freelancers don't have access to that, so I basically will do a closer line edit, and then the system will send out the entire article of what it looks like to the writer. And it gets edited by a second editor here who's not me, and that editor might have notes. And then my boss, the deputies here read every story, and they might have notes. And then if there's an issue in the story that's sensitive, if you're talking about race, if you're talking about LGBTQ issues, if you're talking about the war, if you're talking about any sort of those type of things, there's another editor called the standards desk that will want to read the story as well, because they don't want one minor thing in your story can become a huge problem for the New York Times. And you see this happen all the time, people complaining about one line in a story. So that desk is there to try to prevent that from happening, and unfortunately it still happens. But then, so there's another read there. And then sometimes if you're just kind of like writing about, for example, the writer who talked about, her inheritance, if she just like offhandedly talked about like having a bad relationship with someone in her family, the legal team might come in and be like, hey, like, let's talk about like what, like how we're phrasing this, and like if we can do something else about it, because we don't get sued. So anyway, I'm just saying it can seem like a lot for like one sort of story, but you know, they have very high standards here, obviously, and they want to make sure everyone is protected so that no one is getting sued or you don't get a lot of blowback on social media and all of that.
So very time sensitive, and needless to say, you cannot pitch a Christmas story now. It's a little too late for that, I'm guessing. What's the leeway? Like, what's the lead time for, say, if we wanted to pitch you something around that would run in Christmas? When should they have pitched you?
October. So it would be, yeah, it would have been last month, I think, just because it takes time to put together those stories. And then, you know, we're always trying to wrap up the stories that we are working on right now. And that takes a lot of time. Like, I'm trying to wrap a story that I'm getting even messages right now about for tomorrow that a reporter has been working on since July. So it depends, right? On what it is. And this one was like a big investigation. So obviously it took like a lot longer time. But yes, for anything pegged to like a holiday or like the summer, like for example, someone wanted to write a story about how you get into the situation where like your friends are planning a vacation and everyone has a different idea of what the budget should be because everyone's making a different amount of money. Like, how do you sort of navigate all of that? That story was pitched to me back in April for that being like, I want to do the story for the summer. And I'm like, great, let's think about that and plan on that. So, and I always say like what I like with, especially with freelancers who I've worked with multiple times, I'll be like, pitch me stuff. Yes, pitch me, like it's April, pitch me something for the summer, but also like think about what you want to pitch me later in the year too. And you can tell me about that now and I'll let you know if that works. So like, don't think about like one pitch from the other, like think about sometimes what pitches might look like over the course of a year. And if you can let me know that in advance, I'm happy to accept more than one pitch at once. And then great for the freelancer because then they don't have to plan out like, what am I going to write about next month? Like they have an assignment that they know they'll have 7 months from now, 8 months from now, right? So
that's a perfect segue into our lightning round, which I want to do before we take questions. And so for this one, I'm just going to ask the panelists to raise their hand if it's a yes for you. And Mike already answered one of them, so we can start with that one. It's, do you want multiple story ideas in one email? Please raise your hand if you say yes. Yes? Okay. So Reyhan, no. Okay. Send her in one at a time. Got it. Okay. Do you offer kill fees in case a pitch does not run? All right. Good. Do you care if people pitch you and another publication at the same time? Okay.
I think it'd be helpful if you disclose that.
Okay.
But I don't have a problem with it.
Okay. Manseen, what was your answer? You said don't do it?
No, I said there's no problem, but because
Okay.
things move so quickly, yeah, just keep that in mind.
Okay. So is it okay to follow up on a pitch in, say, 2 days if we haven't heard from you? Yes, no? Okay. Is it okay to follow up in a week? Yes, okay. Let me see. Is there a good day of the week to pitch? And if it's a yes, please unmic and let us know. I know, Reyhan, you mentioned like a Thursday meeting of some sort, so I'm wondering.
Yeah, our Thursday pitch meetings close on Wednesdays afternoon. So if you pitching earlier in the week is better.
Okay. Anybody else have
just
any more?
any day that's not a weekend. Just like there's so many things that come in on the weekend.
Okay. Got it. Well, I also, before we go to questions too, because I'm sure this will be one, can you share your email address in the chat so people can send you pitches? You can get flooded with them like Mike was talking about earlier. And also, Mike, I think when we were speaking earlier, you mentioned something important about reaching out to you and how freelancers should, if they should follow up on LinkedIn or other social platforms and what that looks like for you.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I I have a Twitter account that's active, but I never look at it just because Twitter is just a mess right now. If you're trying to message me on Twitter or DM me there, I'm not gonna really be able to see it. Just like email is just right now the best place. Some freelancers will try to connect with me on LinkedIn or will try to add me as a friend on Instagram, which is very weird. Like, if I don't know you, please don't do that. You know, wait till we have an actual relationship and then it's fine. But even then, if I'm not your friend, don't add me on Instagram. Like, I try to keep my Instagram just like, you know, I don't even follow celebrities, right? I just want to have them be the people that I know. Um, but uh, but yeah, if we do have a working relationship, it's perfectly fine to add me on LinkedIn at that point.
Great. Reyhan?
Yeah, it's a hard no on Twitter, LinkedIn pitches. I think I mean, I'm sure in my life I've gotten something on Instagram, but like, but yeah, I mean, like, just like, it's a bad idea. And I will also say that it's kind of a pet peeve of mine when I get a lot of messages from people who are like, you know, can we talk about if you're open to pitching? Like, I just think that, like, you know, I think it's I can answer yes, but like, what I really need to see is a pitch, you know. Unfortunately, you know, and I think a lot of people like to send an email that's like, hey, just sort of like, I think they're kind of looking for
getting the feelers out,
you know, like, but I don't think that's very effective.
Get to the point. Got it. Manseen?
Yeah, the best way to pitch to me is absolutely email. And of course, I don't know if everyone heard the news, but Business Insider, which was once Insider, but no one really latched on to that name, is now back to Business Insider. So when you're pitching me now, you can pitch Logan at businessinsider.com, but I will be responding to the insider.com email as well. And I also wanted to go backwards a little bit again about the pitches and the drafts that I take in. One of the pet peeves for the stories, because they're a quick turnaround, is submitting verification documents for financials and everything. I feel like that just makes it easier if you're sending something and you're sending a story and we've already locked it in. Make sure that you can verify everything that's stated. The sooner the better and the quicker.
All right, let's get to everyone's questions. Margie asks, can each person share an example or two of a recent freelance pitch and article they accepted? I think that she might have asked that before we went into it, but did anyone have anything else to add about freelance pitches that they want to see that you didn't already cover? Yes, Manseen.
Yeah, I'll add something in there. I don't think I really necessarily said the topics that I'm currently chasing right now, but I'm very much interested in relocation stories. So people who are leaving the US for jobs or other reasons and their experience there. It's a real estate type story. Also, again, careers, if people are job hopping, if people are double dipping, whether your boss knows or not, I'm interested in that, like multitasking and doing multiple jobs remotely, and how different experts feel about that. Maybe you're doing that yourself or you've caught someone doing that, you know, as a manager. And those are the main things. And of course, always job diaries, but those two things, relocation. And another thing, if you are a local in a certain city or country and you're tired of relocators and you have, you know, some type of something to say about that's fruitful, I'm interested in that too.
All right. Julie says, can you give examples of what you see too often that's not working? Mike, you want to start with that one?
I mean, it's just like oftentimes I'll get pitches of stories of when you think of personal finance, it's very like, oh, I want to pitch a story about, you know, retirement. And it's just like, you know, how it's hard for people, you know, sort of the typical stories of what you think of when you think of personal finance. But I hope that with some of the examples that I've shown of like more of the fun things like the breakup budget and these other things that you can sort of like cast a wider net of what you consider personal finance can be. And even if it's just something like, for example, so the Times loves young people, like stories about young people, because they're just like fascinated by what young people are doing, and oftentimes like it's very eye-rolly. So like my whole thing is when we do those type of stories, I prefer a young person to do those stories, and I want younger voices. I want to work with newer freelancers, people who are in their early mid-20s who want to freelance and write for the Times. And you know, that is like one of the things that I did when I had started the Billfold like a decade ago, was develop voices like Gian Tolentino, who's like this all-star like reporter and writer now, but when she was like 23 years old. But yeah, so like the things that don't work are like what you think that I want. And I think one thing I did was I wrote a story about how my parents had no money for retirement and how they basically are relying on me. And I wrote that story because when I initially joined the Times, I was getting all these pitches that were sort of more traditional. And I was like, no, I'm going to write the story I want to see. And so if you look up that story, it's me talking about my parents and sort of this like cultural issue that I think a lot of people in this country go through but don't really talk about. And those are the type of stories that when I was like, I'm getting so many pitches that aren't working, like this is the story I want. And I think like that I had that tweet pinned to my Twitter account. It was like, I wrote this story, please pitch me more stories like this, because yeah, less of the traditional stuff, more of like the really interesting sort of personal things that you can sort of expand.
And that's so helpful for them to see that example straight from the source. That's great. Any other quick don'ts that you guys want to throw out there?
I just can't underline enough how much someone should be familiar with a publication before pitching. Like almost all my don'ts are things that just like you would never see in Businessweek. Like we don't publish personal essays. We rarely use the first person. I mean, so I feel like when I get a lot of pitches that are just like, here's a thing I did, it's just like, it's hard for me to want to kind of cultivate a relationship in some ways, because I feel like they're not pitching me exactly. So I just think that like, you know, the best thing you can do is kind of look at what a thing is already doing and try to imagine if what you want to do really fits into their rubric.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and just continue what Reyhan is saying. Know the editor that you're pitching to, or know that desk that you're pitching to. For me, like Reyhan, send me the personal stories because that's what I'm looking for, you know. But as far as like the long features and the long reports and the investigative journalism, like that's not my beat or the area that I work on. So when I get those pitches, if it's something really fascinating, of course, I'll pass it to that desk. Like, oh, this just came and I can't do anything with it, but maybe another desk can. But because there's so many pitches to look through, that's not what I'm usually looking for.
So not only research a publication, but research the type of stories that editor usually publishes. So Reyhan, so someone asked, you said that Businessweek requires scale. So does that mean it has to be a global phenomenon, or could it be a wide scale, something that happened in a country?
It doesn't have to be global. It does not have to be global. I just think that and it can be, it can be, you can make a case that a very local thing is kind of like emblematic of something else. But I think that when it comes to covering companies, Businessweek tends to want to feel like there's some impact. So like we're not a good place for stories about like a really cool company that just got started and doesn't have much of like a following quite yet. I mean, like you can tell a story about like founders because this kind of founder is like, again, emblematic of something else. But if you look at Businessweek, you'll see that they, like to cover sort of like bigger things. And in a way that's kind of, it's interesting because like Businessweek sometimes I feel like doesn't care about being first necessarily, but they do want to be thorough. So if you have original reporting on something, we're definitely interested in it. And I think, I think there's also any of these rules, they can be broken, for the right story. But in general, I think, yes, the bigger, the better.
This next question is for Mike. How does fact checking work in the New York Times editing process?
So obviously the reporter should be checking a lot of facts, but that will happen mostly with our second editor, who will look at all the names that they have, whether it's spelled correctly, and then we'll look up like LinkedIn to double check those names. We will, like, if you're citing a statistic of some kind, like everything needs to be linked to where you're getting the reports, and we will never put something in without having access to something like that. But yes, generally we are very good with trying to do all the fact check during the very intensive editing process. But as you can see, like the Times issues corrections all the time for different things, and it could be, and we don't catch everything. I know, like, for example, I had a writer who was just like, oh, I was talking about this person's grandmother, but it was his grandfather, and I sort of mixed that up in my notes and didn't catch it. So we had to issue a correction just because of that. But so we won't go to that like specific level, but for a lot of the bigger things, the figures, some of the quotes and things like that, we'll check.
Arias asks, can Manseen explain what she meant by financial verification documents? Is that for fact checking?
Yeah, so that's completely internal. So anytime, a lot of our stories, again, also are framed around money, finance, the business capital. And so when we have these fascinating sources that said, I made $9 million in revenue, joining this program, and I regret it still, it wasn't worth it. Well, we have to make sure they made $9 million. So whether that's a tax document, something to prove it, it has to be there. We can't publish anything really, any stats, finance that hasn't been proven. So finding people that are willing to be vulnerable and to share those with a freelance writer, you have to have that relationship and make sure you can submit those.
Yes. Mike and Reyhan, can you talk about where you see long form narrative journalism going? It's hard out here. Thinking of your prior roles as well as your current roles.
I mean, Mike is Mr. Long Reads. I mean, look, it's died and risen many times. I feel like it still will. The financial life of freelancers is, I think, incredibly difficult and probably only getting harder. So I don't know. I don't know that I can say where it's headed, except I think that there is always going to be an appetite for immersive reporting. Paying for it, I think, is another thing. But I have to say, I think I've seen the rates come up overall in the industry over the past couple of years. And I think like everyone who's pushed for pay transparency deserves credit for that. I think it's like harder to get away with like truly laughable rates without like someone posting it somewhere and embarrassing a company. But I do think that, like, we're in a really bad moment right now. There's layoffs going on across many companies. I've heard that freelance budgets were cut a lot last year. I can't imagine that many will grow next year. So, it seems cyclical.
Yeah, I agree. It is a very difficult time for it, but for really well-told stories, there will always be a place for that, especially at the Times. I know that the Times in general has been moving towards shorter stories just because, like, what we've been seeing at reading levels, most people don't finish all the way at the bottom for these articles. So they're asking us what, again, this is why when we have a story that's more than 2,000 words, we have to really make a case for it, because they're saying readers do not finish. Like they're not going, they'll read the first half of the story and then move on to a different story. So why are we spending all this time and resources into these longer stories if no one's reading the entire thing, right? Which, fair enough. But I think you can always make a case, right? So I will always, like in the editing process, being like, we can't cut this. Like this is just too important to the story, or it requires it for the story, right? And like there are different long form avenues here at the Times. Obviously, the New York Times Magazine is a great place for that, and their rates are very good. It is difficult to get into your story there unless you have been reporting for a long time or have deep background into something. But even for me, like I will always make a case, just because again, like I have that background and I want to do a little bit more of it. Like if we can, it is worth making a case for it. But there are fewer places to do it, or at least to do it and get paid well. So
They have an advocate in you. That's good. The next question, anonymous asks, Reyhan, do you take pitches for print and online?
Yes.
Okay. Mike, can you repeat what month you're planning for now in terms of freelance story pitches? Good question.
I mean, the month doesn't really matter unless it's like pegged to a holiday or something, right? So I'm already thinking about tax season right now. I'm planning for that, and we're going to be having a meeting at the end of the month, because a lot of those things we have to put together a special issue for it. So things like that in advance. But I mean, in terms of like more general sort of pitches, I'm not really thinking of like I need that for February or whatever, right? Like you pitch me that and I will figure out how to prioritize that story. And sometimes I will say like I'm planning this story for 2 weeks from now, and then a war breaks out and I will say we are not publishing this story because no one will read it. Everyone wants to read about Israel Gaza right now, and if we publish a story, no one's going to read it, so we will hold it, right? So like that is part of the discussion, right? And I try to keep everyone informed, but and sometimes pitches come in and they're more timely than others, so I will like move things around as like part of like the dance of like scheduling new stories, but we will figure it out. So if you're like, oh, I don't want to pitch Mike right now because he's only looking for stuff that will be published in February, that might not be the case. If you have a compelling thing that could go up next month, I will prioritize that story for next month. So
Good notes. Can you share some examples of stories that you have commissioned that are international, non-US stories?
So I love like sort of these world stories. So we had this story about how and it was a writer in Seoul in South Korea who wanted to write a story about how at weddings in Seoul, like how is money is like the main gift you get. Like there's no such thing as like a wedding registry where you put like I want a pot and pan, right? Like that's just not a thing in a lot of Asian weddings. It is like give me some money in an envelope, but it was like how much money, and like there's this whole culture about like what the money means and like what the specific figure amount is and what is disrespectful amount to give and like all these different things. And it was very specific to like weddings that happen in like Southeast Asia, but also like, you know, pulling it back to like it happens here too among the diaspora here. So that is like a really good example of you know, something that's happening internationally. Like I love sort of like the very specific cultural things that are happening in other countries that maybe readers aren't aware. I mean, I feel like it might be familiar to some of us here, but like New York Times readers are always like, what? Like I didn't know, like because they are very much like in their own sort of like box of viewpoint. So but that is a good example of like a fun story, a fun international story.
So you mentioned that they also tied it back to the national. So was it important for the pitches to do that, even if it's an international piece, to tie it back to?
Not necessarily. I only wanted to tie it back because I knew readers were going to be like, it doesn't just happen in Southeast Asia. Like at the Asian weddings here, it happens, right? And I wanted to like, acknowledge that before readers will always complain about anything that they think that you thought was missing or anything. So I made sure that to be in the story, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the thing. Like we don't always need to have it be, I mean, the New York Times is a global 24-hour news operation. Like it doesn't need to just be US focused. So.
Got it. Does anyone else give some examples if you have commissioned international pieces?
I would just say, again, it's not necessarily international framework, but again, like relocating outside of the US. I know that we did do a series with the typical millennial from India, like typical Indian millennial, typical Australian millennial. We had a whole millennial series, and we focus on writers in those different regions and countries about their lifestyle, whether it's how long you stay at home, are you in debt, just different things like that. So there are definitely opportunities always to bring in international focus stories.
Yeah, I haven't, I don't think I've commissioned any. I'm sort of new to Businessweek, but we certainly do and will. Again, the only thing to consider is that like Bloomberg actually is a huge global operation. So the bar can be pretty high if you want to travel for a story that like I think you just have to kind of like, again, make the case that you are the writer who needs to do it and you have the expertise. Although we do something which I've never really seen other places, but we'll take a freelance writer and pair them with a Bloomberg reporter if there's an element of the story that we have special expertise in. And it seems to go pretty well. I mean, it seems kind of difficult also, but we're game for doing that.
All right, so last call for questions. I have one more, but I want to just put that out there that if you still have a question, please put it in the Q&A so we can answer. So this last question is, can each of you describe the intangible elements that make a New York Times personal finance or Businessweek or insider story? What pitches do you bring into the editorial meeting or tell your colleagues about that everyone just says, okay, that's one target? Whoever would like to go first.
I think I'll just jump in. I think with Business Insider, again, just the desk that I'm on specifically, because it does range. So if I say something that, does not resonate with anyone here, don't take that as you have to jump ship. There's other desks. But for me personally, the stories that I'm taking into pitch meetings are stories that are personal, stories that humanize the business experience, stories that are fascinating. So yes, we'll throw out a topic like Gen Z workers, but what source are you going to provide where it's like, oh, wow, I never would have thought that perspective, or, oh my goodness, that's super interesting. Again, staying away from profiles and just advertising, businesses or people, and more so getting into like the humanizing, emotional elements, of this business world.
Reyhan?
What a great question. There are definitely pitches that when they go in the room, everyone is like, yes. I mean, I think that some of them involve like just like a crazy story, like a kind of fraud that we've never really heard of before, or like super colorful characters, that so the reporter has access to. I'm trying to think of a specific pitch. And for some reason, my brain is dead, but like, I think it's just like vividness, access, something new about it, even in the telling of it or in the reporting. And I think like Businessweek tends to have a sense of humor. Like, we publish a lot of very serious things, but I think like editorially, we also like something that has like, kind of like a little like vitality to it in a way that, a writer can elevate material through humor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I already mentioned this. I mean, obviously we cover a range, but again, the New York Times loves stories about young people. So um, I developed this story with one of our reporting fellows here. All of our reporting fellows here are in their like early 20s. And we were talking about, last year when Taylor Swift had announced her concert, that one of the things that young people were doing were they were all signing up for Capital One credit cards. Like this was like their first credit card. And the only reason why they were doing it was to try to get Taylor Swift tickets. And I was like, are they like using these credit cards for other things and getting into like a lot of debt? It's like this is this something that's happening? And she was like, let me find out. And she like went on to Twitter and TikTok and all these and found all these like young, like, you know, people who just got these credit cards and got into some debt and were like, this is their first sort of financial product that they got. But, and they love that story here, right? It's kind of like Taylor Swift, young people, credit card, all those different things. Like they immediately love that story. So
All the
and
all
then
the
and the
elements were
photos
there.
for it. Yeah. And the photos of like young people, they love that. So but I'm
Right,
not saying
right.
like you don't necessarily have to do that. I just know that they're just really fascinated with like young people. And it's one of the reasons why they brought me on. I'm like one of the youngest editors on my desk. And it's because they're like, we need young people and like more younger writers.
Yes.
So yeah.
All right, I know we have a couple minutes left. I know Catherine wants to close us out. So if we can go through the last couple ones really quickly. Mike, Mike, talk about readers complaining if the article misses something. How much does Times take reader nitpicking and complaints to heart?
They don't really.
Okay.
Uh, I mean, they will say like, and obviously they will admit mistakes when they're like, okay, clearly we made a mistake and that usually has to do with a bigger reporting issue, especially with a lot of the misinformation that's been happening around war reporting right now. So they will do that, but oftentimes, again, like we have the standard sets that we work with, and uh, sometimes they'll be like, we disagree with this criticism, right? That we were too light on this person or anything like that, right? And I mean, I will say people here in the newsroom will also disagree. Like sometimes I will disagree with what another editor thinks or what the standards editors think, and that is fine. Like, and
Yeah.
I think that's just part of working at an institution where there are thousands of editors, writers, reporters who all have different points of view, and I think that is why you need diversity in the newsroom, because you need more people who have certain experiences, who can really push back, right, about certain elements. Even when I wrote my very personal story about my parents, the standards desk was pushing back on me about certain things that I went through and they didn't go through, and I really had to be like, no, I'm leaving this story because like I think that you're being too sensitive about certain cultures and the way that we're framing things, but this is my personal experience. So like it really depends. But I will always explain to the writer if there's sort of a disagreement and why it is. And sometimes like that's just out of my hands because they won't publish a story if they don't feel good about something. So.
Thank you, Mike. Catherine, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Shernay. And I just want to say again, thank you so much to Manseen, Mike, Reyhan, and Shernay for being here. I always hear after these webinars, editors are human. Oh my gosh, they were so nice. And I think you all really helped dispel some fear and really clarify what you're looking for. So we're so grateful for you being here with us for this time. And we're going to share this with our community in video and written format so that the word spreads, and hopefully you will get more on-target pitches and we all can have an easier time at work. So I also want to mention, I dropped it in the chat, but I am thrilled to announce that the IIJ 2024 conference is open for registration. We will have 2 full days of learning and community with many, many more amazing editor panels like this and bonus bundle items for people to immediately amp up their freelance game. So please check it out. And we hope to see you at our next webinar, December 9th, I want to say, on travel reporting, and then hoping that everyone has a wonderful holiday season. And we're going to get through this turn in the journalism industry together. Thank you all so much for being here, and we'll hope to see you again soon.